This is something I meant to talk about, I believe, like a week ago, but I just never sat down. I didn't know what I wanted to say. It's something that came up at the last D&D game we played, something that I noticed, not something that we necessarily discussed. And that, since it's been a week since I wanted to talk about it, it's kind of morphed into a different topic, which is engaging players in the game. Getting the players to stop thinking about playing a game, to stop realizing and interacting with the game as a game, and to get them more invested and more in tune with the game. A long time ago, there was an article in Dragon Magazine. I cannot remember the name of the article, but I specifically remember in my mind the illustration that went with it and the example that illustration was based on. And I tried to find that illustration and I couldn't. Instead, we get this one, which is delightful first edition artwork. I love this kind of stuff. But what it was, the article talked about ways to get your players to think more about the game world. For example, and this was what the picture was. The picture showed real life people, not D&D characters, standing in front of a door, and the guy, one of the guys, he had his hand on the door and he was standing way back, like leaning. Let's say he was standing about 4 feet away from the door and then leaning forward with his arm on the door, and then also had his hand trying to turn the handle. And he was looking straight down in front of the door, and there was sort of like a dotted outline on the floor. And the DM was standing next to them and looking at that dotted outline, and the guy was sweating and very nervous. I really wish I had found that picture again. Anyway, the point was, you're in a game, and someone needs to pick the lock on a locked door, but you know that there's a trap on that door. Rather than just rolling the dice real quick to see how it goes, and you would ask the player, okay, explain to me how, your character is going to do this. How is, Rogan the thief going to pick the lock on the door? Now, if you make a regular practice of asking these kinds of things, then it doesn't seem so out of place. But if it's the first time you're asking, okay, tell me how he's picking the lock on the door, it suddenly becomes obvious that there's something more to this situation. On top of that, a lot of times you'll have players that don't get into the world. I'm like this a lot too. I don't really get into the world. If I want to get into the world, you have to let me sit there for a few seconds and imagine it. I have to kind of get in tune and get my brain going to do that. So what this article said was, okay, now you're going to have players, they're not going to be very good at imagining what this situation is really like. So let's go ahead and, kind of cheat it for them. Get that guy up, take him to the front door of the house, and say, show me how your character is picking the lock. Now, rather than trying to just completely imagine another character in another world doing this thing that most likely they don't know how to do, look for traps and pick a lock, you have the player actually go over, and now it's much easier to imagine it because you're actually kind of doing it. The point isn't to actually have them pick the lock. The point is, when you're approaching this door, are you going to stand there and bend over and try and pick the lock? Are you going to kneel down in front of the door and try and pick the lock? Are you going to sit right in front of the door and pick that lock? Or are you going to head off to the side and stand next to the door and try to pick it so that if there is a trap that goes right in front of the door, it misses you? These are things that you don't really consider when you're thinking in your mind. But as soon as you're presented with an actual mock-up of the situation, it just naturally comes to the fore. Maybe you're this rogue character and you go to the front door and then you kneel down immediately in front of the door, and then now suddenly because this is already unusual, you're expecting, well, there's something weird about this. Oh, I bet it's trapped. Oh my gosh, I'm standing right in front of the door. Maybe I better hop to the side real quick. And so now you just have that player engagement, and they're thinking a little bit further into the game. And it's certainly not just a simple die roll. And again, you're not expecting them to actually pick the lock on the door. You're just using it as a model. A similar thing happens when, say, the players are trying to search a room and they're looking for traps or they're looking for secret doors or whatever. And this was not in the article, but this is a situation that I was thinking of just the other day. Maybe there's a big bookshelf. Oh, I was watching a movie or something, and someone goes and pulls a book on the door, and then the wall swings open and they escape. Now everybody kind of knows there's the whole pull on the book and the door opens, the secret door opens. But when you're playing the game, you're sitting at the table and the dungeon master says, okay, you're in a wizard's study, and there's the table of glass vials and other alchemical equipment. And then there's a bookshelf on the other wall. Most of the time, a player's just going to say, okay, I'm going to search. And even if you ask them, well, what are you going to do? They're just going to be like, oh, I'm going to search the bookshelf. You can keep probing them more and more for information. But sometimes, maybe you even know, oh, yeah, you pull on the book to find it. But when you're sitting there at the table and you're kind of on the spot being asked these questions, it doesn't occur to you, oh, I'm going to, pull on each individual book or something like that. The DM the DM shouldn't hold you to that level of detail to begin with, but at the same time, wouldn't it be nice if that level of detail came out? So, if you actually stand that player up, take them over to a bookshelf and say, how would you do this? Some players, maybe their character is a little bit more reckless. They don't give a crap about any of the books, and so he's like, I'm just going to put my hand on this end of the shelf and throw all the books off the end, or I'm going to grab the top of the bookshelf and just dump everything down, and then listen for the clang of metal or see if anything interesting busts open on the floor. But then you're also going to have those players who are going to be like, oh, well, I'm going to, sit there and they're going to see the books in front of them and they're going to be like, oh, yeah, pull on the books. I'm just going to pull each book real quick individually, see if any of them opens up a secret door. Or a lot of times light sources in rooms are kind of glossed over. There's a mention of a light source, but the detail, I guess I'll let me go one step back, because this is going to get into kind of my other main point here, and that's level of detail. When you're describing situations to players glom onto detail. If you mention something, players assume that you're only mentioning it because it's important. Now, this isn't true for everybody, but I've found that it's been true for me. So when you mention something like a light source in a room, most of the people just assume that you're mentioning the light source because the amount of light is important for combat and all that, and so that's the important part about it. If you mention that there's torches and sconces on the wall, players assume, okay, you've just established the level of light, and that's it. If they're trying to search through them for secret doors, they won't latch on to the fact that there's torch sconces on the wall. Maybe one of those, if you pull it or twist it, opens up a secret door. Because the important part of that detail was the level of light in the room, and that's it. Whereas if you mention that there's a bookcase, well, now the books become the important part. So there must be either a book that you pull on to open a secret door, or one of the books is magical, or one of the books is fake, and if you open it up, there's actually, some treasure in it, something like that. So, players latch on to details because they assume that you're only going to mention things that are important. Mentioning a bunch of superfluous stuff can quickly frustrate players because they keep thinking that what you're going to mention is important, and it's not. It's also frustrating because once they learn that not everything you mention is important, now they have to go through everything and find out what of them is important. I had a better point in my mind earlier. I wish I could remember what it was. I think I was reading an example of play. I've been downloading a couple old school rule sets, and I think, was it Osric? It might have been Osric, which is the old school reference and index something. I forget what the C stands for. But anyway, it basically reprints old school D&D. Actually, I think it reprints first edition D&D as opposed to old D&D, which is the basic set. Well, even before the basic set, it's the white box. Anyway, forget that. They gave an example, and they had like example 1. You walk 60 feet down the corridor, and now there's a passage to your left and to your right. Which way do you go? That's very common playing D&D, especially for dungeon crawls. Beneath that, they had a different example, and this one was meant to draw players into it. And in that different example, it was a large paragraph with a lot of detail to it. Now, it wasn't details like, things it was details that were evocative. It talked about the feel of the stone and, whether it was rough stone or worked stone. And it talked about the dampness and the sound of dripping water. And there was a slight breeze and the breeze smelled like blank. I actually didn't read the paragraph, so I'm just making up stuff as I go. And how the thief is, carefully stepping along and examining everything with his torch and feeling it grooves in the stone to see if, if it's just a gap between two different flagstones or if there might be a pressure plate hidden underneath one and you need that gap to allow for movement and all that kind of stuff. Now, if you were a DM, especially if you're, very few DMs consider themselves super awesome sauce DMs. Everybody kind of operates under the assumption that they're not very good at it, or they're just struggling to get by. But anyway, if you read that example and you see how much detail went into that one paragraph, and all that paragraph models in real terms is that you moved 60 feet down a corridor and then you can go left or right, that can be very intimidating. You don't always need that level of detail. You should always work to add detail in, especially evocative detail. These are just things that help build atmosphere. Talking about the style of the stonework, and things like that. The style of stonework, sounds you hear, smells you smell, the dampness of the air on your skin. These help to draw players in. These are details where they can then begin to, in their minds, imagine what it's like to actually be there. These are slightly different than the details we were talking about earlier. The things that are placed in the room. The things that you choose to mention. The features of a room you choose to mention. The furniture you choose to mention. PCs automatically zoom in on those things. So, to one degree, if you don't present any information, they have nothing to zoom into. And so they, who cares about this room? Let's move on. And the more things you mention, the more things that they're going to zoom in on. Oh, did I have a point coming up here? Well, I kind of already established the point earlier in that you need to, the more details you give, the more they're going to look into. And taking them out of the theater of the mind, as it were, and showing them real-world examples helps to establish experiences that they can then bring back into the realm of the mind. For example, yesterday my cousin and I went to the Renaissance Festival and we met Big Mac there. And while we were watching the joust, one of the characters in our Pathfinder game is a mounted knight character, and he hits people with a lance from his horse. And so my cousin, even without my prompting, he's like, oh, well, that must be just like, that one character. The funny thing is I don't know the character's name. I know his horse's name, and it is a rude term, and I'm not going to mention it. But I think what is it? Valderin? I don't know. Whatever. The knight's he's a mounted combatant, and my cousin had never seen real jousting before. Not that the Renaissance Festival is real jousting, but it's real enough. And so now he had a better idea of what it kind of looks like when a horse charges and you hit someone with a lance, and especially when the lance shatters. Things like that. And so now when he goes back to roleplay, he has a better idea of what that looks like. Just like if you take a guy to the front door and you say, okay, well, show me how your guy's going to pick the lock, you have a better idea of what it's like to actually kneel down and try and pick a lock. And when you go to search a bookshelf, having an actual bookshelf lets you, imagine a little bit better how you're going to do that. I mean, everybody's seen a bookshelf before, but how many times have you tried to search a bookshelf? And having a real one in front of you, that frees up all that brain power that would have been spent trying to imagine what a bookshelf looks like, because there's one right in front of you, and so that part of your brain it can now be devoted more towards what does searching a bookshelf look like. That was one that I remembered for sure. And actually, the example in that Dragon article told you to look at the ground in front of the door. Just look at it. Maybe, make with your eyes, make a little box on the ground and pretend, put a lot of focus on that so that the player thinks there's a trap there, but there actually isn't. I did that the very day I read that article. I managed to do that in a game we were running back then. And yeah, it freaked the players out just like that. That was more of a fun with players part. But the actual point of the article that I took away from it was to engage the players that way. Because a lot of, especially when you get more towards the old school D&D, there's not rules for everything. And so a lot more of it, like we were talking about traps the other day, how traps work on real world principles. So if you can figure out how the trap works, you can disarm it. A lot of stuff works that way. I was reading just before I started recording this. I mean, literally, the last thing I did before I popped open Camtasia to record this. There was a thread on EN World about the different styles of combat. First edition combat versus 4th edition combat. Not that it was necessarily demarcated that way in real life, but just using those as examples. 4th edition combat is combat as sport. That's the term that the author used. The point of combat is you have evenly matched sides, and whoever uses the best teamwork and tactics wins the battle. And as an example of this, he said, okay, look at the sword fight between Inigo Montoya and the Dread Pirate Roberts in Princess Bride. You have two essentially, mostly evenly matched fighters, and they go back and forth, and one eventually ends up winning. But it's evenly matched to begin with. The other one is combat as war, and this was more old school 1st edition kind of stuff, where the entire point is if you're stuck in a fair fight, you've already kind of lost the game at that point. You should be stacking the deck in your favor as often as possible, because in real life, if you're literally fighting for your life, do you want it to be a fair fight? No. You want every odd to be in your favor. You want to lie, cheat, and steal as much as possible because it's your life on the line. And that gets back to kind of this whole verisimilitude and getting yourself in the game. Who wants to actually fight an orc in a fair fight? Nobody. Who wants to shoot an orc from half a mile away with a sniper rifle instead? Me. That would be my preferred way to defeat an orc in battle. Not even be near it. So, and as an example of this, there's the scene in the Indiana Jones movie where there's the guy with the sword and he's flashing it around, and then Indy just draws a gun and shoots the guy. That's not a fair fight. No actual combat took place, but Indy won. And as another example, he had a more drawn out example where, for example, the PCs were, I just said example twice in a row. The PCs want to get honey. There's some giant bees in the area, and giant bee honey is worth money. So they're trying to get the bee honey to get the money. They want the money honey, or the honey money. And so like in 4th edition, they talked about how the fighter's going to make sure he's standing in the correct area so that when the bees come in, so that when the wizard casts his fireball spell or whatever, it hits the bees but not the fighter, and then when the bees rush past to try and attack the wizard, the fighter's able to stop them and do cleave attacks and what have you. And that the wizard is there healing the fighter, not the wizard. And that the cleric and the rogue are filling their positions as well. So it's a very tactical combat. The bees get defeated. The honey is now theirs. Whereas the 1st edition players decide that they're going to cover themselves in mud and spread oil around the area of the hive so that they can force the bees a certain direction, and that one of the characters is going to dress in a bunch of layers of leather armor and then cover himself in mud, and then he's going to head out to the owlbear cave and throw rocks at the owlbear until it starts chasing him, and then he's going to run by the beehive where the other party members have agitated the bees enough so that when the bees come out of the hive, they see the owlbear and they attack the owlbear instead, and then while the bees and owlbear are fighting, they go and steal the honey. That's the way that happens. Why fight the bees when you don't have to? All you want to do is steal the honey. So that's kind of the end of this. If I had to reemphasize, I guess the point would just be try and find ways. You want to give your players enough detail that they have something to do. You don't want it to be you walk down a corridor left or right. You want to add some of that evocative detail in there. Try not to give your players so many details that they have no idea how to pick out what's important and what's not. There should be some details that are quote-unquote unimportant. Sometimes a bookcase is just a bookcase. But on the other hand, know that when you do add a detail, the players are going to look at that detail, because otherwise they assume you don't have a reason to mention it. The next part is try and find ways to get your players more into the game. The evocative detail is the one way. The other way is give them these real world examples. If you're lucky enough, and you have the option, like there's some, I live, right next to the Rocky Mountains. And the other week when I drove up to an Indian Health Service hospital for an interview, I drove through some excellent, inspiring canyons. Brain is not working here for words. Some very inspiring canyons. It was a beautiful landscape. I really wish I had my camera. But there was an old prestige class I made up called the Cliff Raiders. And they would literally like jump off the top of cliffs, and they had especially tied themselves with these ropes and things so that when they got to the bottom, they wouldn't hit the ground, or it would they wouldn't hit the ground, so they wouldn't take falling damage. But they could jump off the edge of a cliff with a spear and impale you, and they would be safe. Or they would wrap themselves up, and when they jumped down, the tension on the rope would cause them to spin violently around, and they would just hold their weapons out, and it would slice you to pieces, things like that. Anyway, going and seeing actual cliffs, and in your mind, you think more of a cartoony, straight cliff edge right down, kind of like you would see in a Roadrunner cartoon. Whereas in real life, cliffs are much more uneven and rocky and that. And so you see these things. If you're imagining a PC in a cliff and he wants to climb up after them, if you've only seen the Roadrunner cartoons, cliffs are sheer. They're very flat surfaces going straight up. So you're like, no, you can't climb. There's not a lot of handholds in that. Whereas if you see a real cliff, you're like, okay, that's mostly straight, but yeah, there's plenty of ways to get up. That was something I wanted to point out. Okay, awesome. I'm glad I covered that story, because one of the examples that I was thinking of earlier, I was taking a walk because today's my day off. Yes. Details that you add are going to influence how players play the game. I already made that statement, but this is a slightly different way to say it. If you mention, you're setting up a battlefield and you say there's a wall, cutting through the battlefield at some point, players are going to try and use that. They're going to get behind it and use it as cover. They're going to try and hide behind it so that they can become stealthy and sneak attack people, things like that. If you say that there's a wall made of rough bricks with plenty of handholds, and you actually say plenty of handholds, someone's going to want to maybe try and climb that wall. If you mention that there's a wall cutting through the battlefield and it's sagging in the middle and it looks like a stiff breeze might knock it over, players are going to try and knock it over, or they're going to avoid standing near it because they're afraid it'll be knocked over. Tiny little details like that change how players interact with the game world. So sometimes you want to just say it's a wall because all you want is a barrier. Sometimes you want to say it's got handholds so that people climb up on the wall and try and gain like high ground. Maybe an archer pops up there and starts shooting people. Sometimes you want to say it's able to be pushed over. And so to encourage people to use the terrain like a weapon. Sometimes you don't want to say these things. If you just say that there's a wall, sometimes you don't want to say these things. If you don't say anything, especially if your players haven't been trained to think of the game world more verisimilitudinous, I don't know the exact word there. If you just imagine a wall, you're going to probably imagine a well-built, solid wall and want to use it for cover. You're probably not going to imagine a wall that you can climb up. You're probably not going to imagine, you're very unlikely to imagine a wall you can push over. But once players are trained to think of that world, and this will get into a different thing entirely, once players kind of accept the fact that they can help build the world, then they're more likely to add these details. A lot of players, and even like modern gaming, you assume that the DM is the guy who creates everything. You're only in charge of your own character. You get no input into the world because that's the DM section. It's not always true. In fact, one of the things about old school D&D is you want the players to take as much initiative as possible, because being responsible for everything sucks, especially when you're running like a sandbox game where it's the players who have to figure out, what they want to do, and they're the drivers of the game. You already have so much on your plate that you want players to say, oh, can I push over that wall and knock it onto people? And so in that case, you want to encourage that kind of play. You want to And that's why the old school D&D mentality, or, what it should be, is to say yes. It's okay to say no, but you're trying to find ways to say yes. That way, when a player comes up with an idea or a player expresses a certain understanding of something, you kind of want that understanding or that idea to be true, and you want to work towards making it true. I was reading another book, and it's kind of like a how-to guide on making a sandbox game. I've only read a couple pages into it, and it's tied to an actual adventure. There's like an adventure that you get, and then literally half the book, it's like 180 pages. 90 pages of that is how to do a sandbox game. But they give an example. If a player misunderstands something, and it's not really, unless it massively changes something, go ahead and let that player's misunderstanding become true. Go ahead and write in your notes that this is the way that this works, because, that's the way the player thought it did. This was true, in this instance, they were talking about a city game, because cities shouldn't seem strange and unfamiliar. You want the cities to seem more familiar and easier, because that's the kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? The mood you want to set for a city game. Unless it's you want dungeons to seem strange. You want the wilderness far away from civilization to seem strange. And so there, having player expectations be wrong is okay, because it helps to set that mood. But in a city, when a player gets something wrong and you say, oh no, that's not how it works, it's this way, what you've just done is say, hey, the way that you expect this world to work, it doesn't work that way. And that takes you out of the world, because now you're like, oh, well, my intuitive understanding was wrong, and now suddenly you're broken out of that that verisimilitudinous really need to that verisimilar world. You no longer are imagining standing in front of a bookcase, because now you don't know how bookcases work anymore. So you say, yes, that's the way it works, because now that player doesn't get taken out of the game that way. His intuitive understanding still is the correct intuitive understanding to him. Oy vey, that's even longer than I wanted to go now. I'm really good at this. I'm really good at rambling for long periods of time. So just to reiterate that last point, when you add details, players are going to latch on to them, and so the way you detail something kind of dictates to a degree play. If you have players that are willing to help you create the world, if you have a player who, when otherwise not told that a wall can be knocked down, thinks, hey, can I knock that wall down? Say yes. Let them have that, that input and that level of creative power in the game world. It helps to engage players. You'll find them making up details more often. Now, you can't let them abuse that power. It can't be that every single time they want to do something, it happens, because then there's that lack of challenge now. Players who have too easy of a time are going to lose interest. They need something to strive against. So you can't let them abuse the power to make everything too easy, but you certainly do want to accept ideas whenever possible. And I'm not going to talk about this, but that ties into letting players' understandings and misunderstandings tie together sandbox games. A lot of stuff you do in a sandbox game, as I've been reading more and more about it, like random encounters, random dungeons, things like that. As a DM, a lot of times you want to design these things. You want them all to make sense. But the thing is, on the other side of the screen, if the players imagine that everything already makes sense, they're going to make sense of it for you. So you can put together a random dungeon, and they will come up with the ideas on their own on how it all makes sense. And so then, when they mention them, you want to say, yes, that's true, that's how it works. Not all the time, of course, but a lot of the time. Okay, I think I'm going to end the video there, because I'm just going to keep rambling on about one subject after another. Until next time, bye-bye.